Hello buddy, yeah, it's Wyvern here with this week's episode of Fixing the Forgotten, the series where we discuss a faction's underperforming, underwhelming, or underutilized lords, heroes, characters, units, and regiments of renown, and talk about what could be made to make them a little more viable, a little more competitive, and a little bit more appealing in the multiplayer scene. In this week's video, we will be discussing the Vampire Counts, a faction that's had its ups and downs over the course of the years, and definitely suffers from having roster bloat in certain areas. For example, its lord selection in particular is one of the most diverse in the game, and as a result there are several that are kind of glossed over and end up falling by the wayside in favor of the more competitive or more generally useful lord options. And so we're going to be focusing on that, focusing on some of the niche units here, and looking at what could be done to make them a little better. So kicking things off, a character that might not surprise many, if any, it's Helman Gorst. However, I don't actually think Helman Gorst is really that much of a meme anymore. At one point he was certainly kind of a joke character, a character you didn't bring unless you were just messing around and didn't care to win. But he's come a long way. At the moment, he is a dirt cheap Mortis engine. He does have a rather excellent Corpse Cart, which if we look here, you can see he gets the Vigor Mortis aura, so you get extra combat stats to nearby units. He gets the Reliquary of Corruption, which is obviously the Mortis engine effect. He's got the Unholy Lodestone for those AoE heals. Does lack the extra winds of magic a Mortis engine would provide, but really he provides some very excellent support abilities, plus of course the usual Necromancer buffs. He's got the Master of the Dead for an extra 4 HP per second to nearby units, and then he does have Curse of Undeath, of course with the lore vampires that he gets. Besides that, keep in mind he doesn't have a regen of his own, so his HP recovery is pretty quick. He's a fairly beefy lord if he isn't getting bursted down very quickly, though obviously you don't want him getting shot. He's very slow. He does have the Liber Noctis for some good winds of magic, and Magical Animas, which usually you don't really care for. Who cares for 16 leadership when you're undead, but you know, it's there. That said, there's a few little things I think could be tweaked. For one, his speed is incredibly low. 23 speed is, in my opinion, a bit crippling. It's so slow that you can't even keep up with Graveguard, who sit at 27 speed. Much less more mobile Vampire Count infantry like Crypt Ghouls or Cairn Wraiths or Skeletons. You really can only move along with zombies, and that really slows your entire army down. It slows down the pace of your engagement. And for a faction like Vampire Counts, where your entire build is going to be centered on a rush the vast majority of the time, because, well, you're all melee, so you don't exactly have a huge amount of choices there. The fact that you're stuck with a very, very slow lord and clumsy lord is a problem. So that's one thing, and I think obviously could be rectified. Just give Helman Gorst like an extra 5 or 6 speed. I don't expect him to be faster than infantry base, but I think his Corpse Cart could be a little faster than a generic Corpse Cart. Just a tiny smidge. Bump it up to like 27, 28 speed. Maybe as much as 30. Something to give him a little bit more functional mobility. Obviously, I'm not expecting him to be a speed demon, but just give him a little bit more maneuverability. The other thing that I think could be nifty for him is some sort of tweak to his summon. At the moment, Awaken from the Grave is his replacement for the zombie summon. It summons Graveguard, and one Overcast, it summons a White King. The problem is that both of these units are incredibly grind-oriented units. They're units that get their value from fighting for a sustained period of time, for being engaged in a slogfest. Except they disintegrate. They're summoned. They don't last very long. So unlike a unit like the Manticore, which is a one-shot wonder, you just point and click it at a target and it goes in, suicides, but will basically net its value if it lands like 2 or 3 good hits, which makes it insanely good, of course. Unlike zombies, where they're essentially a net and a body blocker, so if the fact that you have a 60 seconds worth of body blocker and net is amazing. I actually believe they last like 2 minutes officially, but whatever. The fact that you get an extended net and body blocker is excellent. The fact that Graveguard can't really stick around to do their job is hurtful, and I think the summon could last a little bit longer, perhaps make it a little more enduring. Maybe come with a increased winds of magic cost. Obviously, personally, I'm in the camp that summons should be reworked as a whole, but that's not what this video is about. Working within the current mechanics of the game, I would like to see his Graveguard summon made a little more longer lasting. Make it something like Krell, where he does stick around for quite a while and can be a presence on the battlefield. Otherwise, though, I think Gorst is actually in a pretty solid spot. I don't really want to see much else changed on him, but I did think it's worth mentioning some of these mild tweaks I think he could get. Moving down the line, the second legendary lord here is Isabella von Karstein. She's not a terrible character on paper. She does have some of the same debuffs as Vlad does with Master of Beguilement. She's got a kind of cool buff with Red Fury. And of course, her main signature item, the Blood Chalice of Bathory, which heals a single target character or for almost 2500 HP and restores their vigor. Essentially, it can heal cap any character in the Vampire Count roster that she may be paired with. She can heal cap herself in a single cast of this, essentially. And she can heal cap a Vampire, a White King, a Banshee, or I guess a Necromancer. But the problem is, almost all Vampire Count lords and heroes regenerate on their own. They all have the hunger. And plus you've gotten to Heck and your passive heal spam. And the big beefy characters that you would probably like to support, like a character on a dragon, you can't bring because Isabella herself is a lord, so she's taking up your lord slot. So what I would actually like to see for Isabella is seeing her move given the Gotrek treatment. Gotrek, of course, in campaign is a legendary lord. He is a lord in his own right. But I would like to see Isabella, but he is a hero in multiplayer. I would like to see Isabella given the same treatment. Keep her a legendary lord in campaign. I think it's cool to have an extra start as the Karsteins, but make it so that she can be a legendary hero in multiplayer. I think it would make her much more viable. Perhaps she would need some stat, or really not stat, but price adjustments. But we already have a plethora of legendary heroes. Isabella's obviously a bit of a relic of Warhammer 1 days when legendary heroes weren't a thing. But with legendary heroes becoming more and more prominent, I think it would be cool to see her being essentially downgraded to legendary hero. It would give her more synergy. It would let her support beefier and tankier Vampire Count lords. Keep in mind, you still have to pay for Isabella, who's not a cheap character. Even if you just bring her with Blood Chalice, she is a 1100 or so gold character, so she's not dirt cheap, and her combat stats aren't on par with, say, a Blackrock Big Boss or whatever that you might bring for a similar price point. So she's not that cheap of a character. Could also be cool just to have a vampire hero with actual lore vampires. That would be my recommendation on Isabella. I don't think she's a terrible character in and of herself. I just think she's always going to struggle for a niche as long as she doesn't really have much to support on the vampire roster. And I think downgrading her to a hero would be neat. Would also leave some cool room to run it in Vlad and Isabella themed builds. Much like right now you can run Ariel and Orion or that sort of thing. Moving on to generic lords, we've actually got one on the other end, and this is obviously limits and multiplayer. You can't bring too many lords, unfortunately. But I didn't want to do a separate thing just for the Master Necromancer here. Master Necromancer, kind of a sad lad. He is your budget caster option. I don't mind that. It's perfectly fine in my opinion that Vampire Counts have this trash tier lord or trash stat lord who essentially just is there to fill your lord slot and give you a caster. However, I could see him getting tweaked a little bit. Give him Arcane Conduit is what I would say. I think it would be fair to give this guy Arcane Conduit. I think all Lord level casters get Arcane Conduit at least, except for some legendary Lord ones, but that tends to be a bit of a outlier. This guy's a generic Lord. He's really meant to be a pure caster, so give him Arcane Conduit. I think it would be a nice touch. Just make him decent at casting spells, not good at much else, obviously, because he can't fight worth a damn. He's not super mobile, unless you give him a Hellsteed. Doesn't have the greatest itemization, but I just think give this guy Arcane Conduit, and I think he'd be in a better spot. Obviously, I'm not expecting him to be a top tier Lord pick, but just to enhance that cheap budget Lord option, get the vibe he's got. On the other end of this table here, we have the Vampire Lord. Vampire Lord is Mr. Generic McGeneric Pants. And really suffers for it. He's basically a generic fighter caster. And he doesn't really bring anything unique to the table. He certainly has decent combat stats. He's perfectly in line with other Vampire Count characters. However, both of his items are self-buffs. He basically soups up his damage output a tiny bit, and he soups up his resistances a little bit with Charmed Shield and sort of anti-heroes. Then he's got Undeath Resurgent. Unfortunately, if you want a fighting caster, you've got far better options, and options that can support a wider area or support in more specific situations. You've got the Red Duke if you need to counteract enemy characters. You have the Blood Dragon, of course, who is an absolutely domineering present with the Helm of Discord. You have the Lamian Vampire Lord, who's got a mixed lore of magic with some excellent support spells. If you need to support a fight in the air, you've got the Karstein Lord, who has the Dark Tempest or the Dark Storm, or Storm of Darkness, whatever it is, the knockoff Tempest, and the Vampire Lord kind of falls off. What does he do well? He doesn't really do anything well. He's not exceptional in any way, and even if you just want a generic sort of fighter and support your army a little bit, you're better off paying a tiny bit more gold for a Bloodline Lord who actually brings some utility to the table. And the Vampire Lord just does not provide that. And of course, he's not a great caster. He doesn't have Arcane Conduit or anything along those lines. One thing I could see given to him is Arcane Conduit, make him more expensive, generic mix of fighter and caster. That could perhaps be an acceptable choice there. Perhaps giving him something like the Tormentor Sword, allow him to snare enemies, give him a little bit more utility in the same vein as what we have with the, say, the Night Goblin War Boss for the Greenskins, where you do get the Tormentor Sword. It gives you a little bit of utility there. Maybe allow him to... I would say give him like an item like the Shrieking Blade or the Mask of E or something like that he can equip. But the problem with that, of course, is that just so you could have be a cheap terror causing option. But the problem with that, of course, is that you already have Lad for a very cheap terror causing option. You've got Banshee, so I don't think that would be a viable choice there. But I could see just going for an even more generic all around character design with this guy. Otherwise, give him some utility, some sort of passive aura, sort of like Hold the Line, for example. Nothing fancy, but something that does provide a constant, steady stream of buffage, which other vampire characters do not provide. You don't get constant AoE buff auras with any other vampire characters. Most of their abilities are sort of bursty, point and click. So perhaps you could have something sustained, something like Hold the Line, to make him a little bit more appealing in a sustained grind situation. Maybe even give him that as well as Arcane Conduit. Make him really that all-arounder, all-in-one package that doesn't excel in anything, but does bring a little bit of everything to the table. Because right now he just is a crappy fighting character as far as the vampires are concerned. Finally, Strigoi Ghoul King. This guy, in my opinion, just suffers from being literally redundant with the more expensive Bloodline variant of this character. The two essentially do almost the same thing. The only real difference is that the Strigoi Ghoul King gets Bloodlust, while the Strigoi Vampire Lord gets the Claws of Morcane, which are a bigger buff but only affects himself. Besides that, you've got some very similar itemization. You've got Potion of Strength. You've got a unique mixed lore of magic. You don't get this bursty self-heal of the Vampire of the Bloodline Lord. But what I'd really like to see is make the Strigoi stand out, separate him a bit more, make one more buff-oriented or support-oriented. Strigois are, of course, and I don't care which of these it is, whether it's the Bloodline or the generic version, just make it so they're more differentiated. And maybe make one oriented at buffing ghouls, for example. One of the big things in the lore is that Strigoi obviously rule courts of crypt ghouls and crypt horrors and this sort of mockery of noble palaces and noble culture. They often command big hordes of sort of war beasts and sort of the more feral vampire count creatures. And for that, I think the Strigoi could be given some buffs. Make those buffs exclusive to those units. Make it so we can specifically buff crypt ghouls, give them more melee attack, give them a little bit more weapon strength, whatever it may be, passively perhaps. Give them some have some passive that provides a resistance aura. Something reflecting the fact that this guy's delusioned and thinks he's a nobleman of old and not a deranged murder monster. And maybe something that provides a sort of small physical resist aura or a small magic resist aura, whatever it may be, to nearby troops. Whatever the case may be, I think there's room to make the Strigoi Ghoul King separate from the Bloodline character. And that's what I'd really like to see done there. Make one a more supporting option while the other one is more the fighter, rather than just essentially a cheaper one that's cheap and one that's a little pricier. They're literally essentially the same character, It's just that there's a gap in cost and a slight gap in stats. The sole hero here is the vampire, and the vampire hero isn't bad. She's a decent fighter. I don't know why she's facing the wrong way here, but looks absolutely gorgeous, of course. Look at them, thigh-high armor boots and gauntlets with impractical armor. Otherwise, very Warhammer. But besides looking excellent, vampires kind of suffer from being a very expensive caster-fighter hybrid. This is sort of a similar issue to what you get with the Lore Master of Hoeth, where they're not necessarily terrible for the cost, but you are definitely paying a lot for a character that doesn't necessarily have any way of generating extra points of magic, and doesn't necessarily provide the best buffs or support. It just kind of, and especially with the advent of mixed lore of magic characters, like especially the Alamian Vampire Lord, these ladies have really fallen off because you can usually bring a character who has the spells you want from the lore vampires provide. Before, at least the Vampire of Shadows had a niche because there was no shadow magic Vampire Lord, and a Vampire of Death, if you didn't bring Manfred, could at least support there. But now with the Karstein or the Necrarch Lord option, as well as the Lamian Lord option, there's even less reason to bring vampires unless you literally just want a cheap fighting hero. And sure, that is an option. It is a viable decision to bring a Vampire of Death, to bring a vampire as a cheap fighting option on a flyer. But I think they could get a slight price cut, drop their price a tiny bit, maybe buff their HP a little bit, make them a little bit beefier. They are, after all, vampires. They are supposed to be fairly survivable, fairly tanky. Maybe make Dark Benediction a different sort of aura. Plus 8 leadership on Undead is fairly worthless, especially with only 30 meter range. It's kind of a joke. You could at least give it some slight melee defense or ward save or whatever boost. You probably don't want ward save just because it would stack disgustingly well with ethereal units. But give it a little bit more melee defense or some sort of tweak there. And I think Dark Benediction... and I think you could make a serious case for a better case for the vampire character, Vampire of Death. Otherwise, maybe give them a trait sort of like this with the Skaven Warlord was, or the Skaven Chieftain was recently given, where they're able to take over the Lord's army and provide a partial army-wide leadership buff when the Lord dies. Obviously, vampires are not necessarily the backstabbing sort the way Skaven are, but they would, or they could be capable of taking over an army that... or perhaps help take control of an army that is when its lord's been slain, especially because they're relying on sort of the dark magic being channeled from the lord. So maybe make it so a vampire can provide a map-wide leadership aura if your lord dies. So they've got kind of this cool niche purpose of having a backup, especially if, for example, you bring a character like Gorst or a Master Necromancer or whatever, a character that's fairly easy to snipe, and you don't want to risk a complete army crumbling if your opponent just happened to go for a super snipe heavy build. Maybe bring a vampire, make it so that vampires can provide a passive leadership aura to hold your army together. Moving on to infantry, there's only 2 here, Crypt Ghouls and Cairn Wraiths, and Cairn Wraiths kind of get lumped in with Hex Wraiths. It's really just the usual ethereal problem. Most ethereal units in this game, at least big units of them, tend to suffer. But Crypt Ghouls, I think, just suffer from having terrible stats. They're fairly expensive infantry that's designed to only mulch lightly armored infantry. Their AP ratio is god-awful. 4 AP is literally, I think, one of the worst in the game. I think even it's on par with like zombies and Skaven slaves. It's a really abysmal AP number. They've got pretty terrible stats, kind of offset by poison, but non-existent armor, low HP, and fairly low leadership. So they're just an all-around kind of poor unit. And I think they could be buffed based on what the regiment around, based on the regiment around. The regiment renowned for Crypt Ghouls is faster, has stalk, has vanguard. Now, I don't expect all these abilities to be dumped on Crypt Ghouls, but I do think it would be okay to give the unit a little bit more speed, maybe a vanguard, even for a slight cost adjustment. I think that would be fair. And if see, I wanted to go for a bigger rework, one that pushed their price up by a more significant margin. Maybe give them hunger. After all, Crypt Ghouls are kind of cannibals and feasters on the corpses of the battlefield and all that stuff. So they could perhaps be given hunger in the same vein as Mourngulls are, and that could help them stick around on the battlefield. But I think at a baseline level, just giving them a little bit more mobility or the ability to vanguard into your opponent's face, or both, in the same way that Dryads, for example, for Wood Elves, because Dryads are also not sort of an excellent top-tier fighting character or fighting unit. But just the fact that they can vanguard and they've got good mobility, allowing them to exploit a quick breach in the enemy line makes them a worthwhile unit choice. And I think giving Crypt Ghouls that sort of utility would make them a much more appealing choice of unit, at least in some sort of niche builds. Moving on to Karen Wraiths, obviously these guys suffer from, and probably suffer the worst from the crumbling mechanic, one of the few units that actually suffer from the crumbling mechanic. Not a terrible unit in niche circumstances. I have made some use of them before myself. I definitely use them in certain builds, in certain factions. That said, obviously, ethereal units get dumpstered by anything that does magic damage, and can fall apart very, very quickly to crumbling. The low leadership is a crippling factor. It's arguably just as bad for Hex Wraiths. Very poor combat stats means they don't dish out hurt quickly. And granted, those stats have been buffed over the last few patches. Karen Wraiths are now in a much stronger spot than they were. It still makes it difficult to really utilize the unit, and it's very unforgiving. Against factions that can bring any amount of magic damage to the field, these units are incredibly unreliable, and you can't count on them to do very much. There's been a few resolutions proposed. One that I think could work is dropping the physical resist down to like 60% and increasing their HP pool to, say, like 5,000 on Karen Wraiths, maybe like 6,000 or something along those lines on Hex Wraiths. Make them more vulnerable to non-AP or to non-magic damage, but make them less vulnerable to magic damage that way, so they could at least tank through the damage a little bit. Otherwise, perhaps just buff the melee defense on the, perhaps just reducing the physical resist by a little bit, and then increasing melee defense by a little bit, and maybe splitting it between, say, missile resistance and some additional melee defense for the extra stats would be nice. Make it to reflect the fact that ghostly targets are harder to shoot and they are harder to hit in close quarters, since you're kind of striking at smoke and mirrors. And I think that could make these units a little more viable, make them a little bit more of an option, because obviously ethereal units are always hinging between being completely oppressive and overpowered and being straight garbage, and there tends to be very little in between, and as a result, people tend not to use them except for matchups where they can really, really shine. And I think making them a little bit more normalized, even though obviously a very extreme unit design, would be a good step. Otherwise, increasing leadership a tiny bit, maybe giving them like +5 or plus 10 might be a bit much, but at least +5 leadership, just to bump these units up to, say, 45, so they hold together a little bit better, could be a good choice. Just to make Karen Wraiths and Hex Wraiths a little bit better, though I will be discussing Hex Wraiths in a little bit more detail. I think Hex Wraiths suffer a little more than Karen Wraiths. Karen Wraiths are so cheap, relatively speaking, and expendable, that you don't cry too much if they get wrecked. It's still not a cheap unit, but they are cheaper, and they also don't have the weird downside of the weird thing is that Hex Wraiths, the fact that they do fire damage actually hurts them in certain situations, like against Dragon Princes or against Dwarves, for example, where this unit might have a niche otherwise with its high mobility. The fact that the unit has fire damage is actually a major downside because it can't hurt, for example, a Trollhammer Torpedo at all. So I actually think removing fire damage on Hex Wraiths could be a decent choice. Actually, we'll just move on to Hex Wraiths. I was going to go Black Knights to go through cost-wise, but honestly, Hex Wraiths, we'll just jump over to them. Besides any general ethereal overhauls, and those would probably have to hit units like Sirens and whatnot too. Hex Wraiths, I think could be, if teleport was an option, some sort of teleport ability would be neat. Just give them even more insane mobility. Give them some sort of bound wind spell. In tabletop, they could dash, I believe, through enemy formations. So giving them some sort of almost wind spell along those lines could be an interesting mechanic, sort of a little bit of bound magic on these guys. Could help them counteract enemy infantry boxes a little bit as well, without having to rely on a Mortis engine. Otherwise, problem with buffing their combat sets, these guys do perform rather well in isolation, but when faced off against a unit with magic damage, they just get obliterated. But obviously, it's difficult to justify buffing these guys without risking making them oppressive against a faction like, say, Greenskins or Beastmen, who, if you buff these guys' stats and suddenly they can rip through a unit like Sons of Koros very easily, you're left with a major problem where Beastmen have a very, very hard time countering Hex Wraiths. And you can bring multiple of these units. I do think a slight cost decrease could be an option on Hex Wraiths. It could go down to 1350 or even 1300 gold. Would still make them an excellent up trader versus units that are not buffed up with some sort of magic damage, but would straight up downgrade them, but would make them a little bit more expendable and free up a little bit more army option against factions where you might expect a counter. And I don't know. It's tough to think of ways to improve a unit as extreme as the Ethereals. So definitely one where I'll be looking to see what you guys have to suggest. But I think Hex Wraith's just kind of in a grim spot. There's matchups where you would think they'd be cool with the magic and fire damage, like Wood Elves, but all the Treekin do magic damage, so they obliterate you. Versus Dwarves, they can't do anything to Iron Drakes. They're okay versus Skaven, but with the increase in Blobbery and constant additions of magic damage sources for Skaven, they've really, really fallen off a good bit. They're much less effective than they once were. It's really just Beastmen, I think, at kind of Greenskins. But even with Greenskins, the magic damage doesn't really work against Stone Trolls, for example. So negates your fire damage advantage there. Just leaves these units in a little bit of a rut. Black Knights with Lances and Barding, next on the list. I actually think are a pretty respectable unit, largely hamstrung by their position on the Vampire Count roster. I think they're wedged in a spot where you either want Black Knights or you want Blood Knights. These guys, will way cheaper than Blood Knights for just charging infantry, are too expensive to just mulch cheap infantry. You're better off for backline disrupt, bring generic Black Knights or dogs or bats, or use summons, or route off the infantry with chariots and monsters than paying for Black Knights. And if you need to deal with large, you have to pay for Blood Knights. These guys will not do well enough against large. They're basically a great chaff cleaner, but in the majority of matchups, they just don't perform. They're also very, very, very micro-intensive. Their sustained combat stats are trash. And it really hurts, I think, if you're not on top of your micro. If you're more of an average micro player like May, for example, this unit falls off hard. You just have no forgiveness. Even less forgiveness than with, say, Knights of the Blazing Sun, where if you leave them in a fight, yes, they will take a lot of damage because their melee defense is potato tier, but they hit very hard still. They still have 40 melee attacks, so they hit like trucks. Black Knights with Lance and Barding don't have that, so a few little buffs I could see for them. One, give them an extra bit of melee attack. Make them essentially budget Knights of the Blazing Sun on the Vampire Count roster. Make it so they have, say, 30 melee attack. Even if you have to down tweak their charge bonus a tiny bit, like drop their charge to 60, for example, give their melee attack, like, say, put it at 30, so if they're stuck in sustained melee, they do a bit better. They can hit a bit harder and hit a little more reliably. Otherwise, give them a smidge more leadership just so they don't crumble that easily. One of those things, cavalry tends to suffer more from crumbling than other units. I'm not sure I think they need that leadership buff. Maybe that could be a little bit of a help there. I don't think they need buffs in other departments, really. For their cost, they're a decent enough unit, just with an ugly spot on the roster between very good Black Knights and very good Blood Knights. So besides the self-sustaining Verex Reavers, it's hard to justify Lances and Barding. But I think buffing the melee attack on these guys would be an excellent way to make them a little bit more forgiving and a little bit more appealing for the Vampire Count players. Moving on to Beasts, War Beasts over here. Dire Wolves, I simply think should be a bit cheaper. Obviously, they're dogs that don't route, which is nice, but their leadership is so low that they crumble incredibly easily. Either make them cheaper or give their leadership a slight boost, make their leadership, say, 35 or even 40, so that they do not crumble on contact. At the moment, it's a huge issue for these guys. They get in one fight and they will crumble out. At least dogs do come back, maybe oftentimes twice in a match, unless they route off the field, whereas Dire Wolves, oftentimes after the first engagement, they will crumble out, even if you are on top of your micro and do pull them out at, say, half health or 2/3 health. They're often crumbling and unsavable at that point. And I do think buffing their leadership could be a good way to go. Either buff the leadership or Give them a tiny bit of armor, like the normal hounds have. Normal hounds have 15 armor. Give them a little bit more resilience, or make them a bit cheaper. But my personal preference is just buff the leadership. Make them a little harder to crumble. Cryptars, a unit that's taken several nerfs. It used to be sort of a staple pick early on in the days of Warhammer 1, and then fell off hard after repeated nerfs over and over and over. I think, honestly, just a small buff to, say, armor would make them a lot more appealing. Give them 30 armor instead of 15, and these guys would be okay. Much like the Hulks, animated Hulks on the Vampire Coast roster. I don't expect Cryptars to be sort of an amazing world-crushing unit. They're ultimately an 800 gold monstrous infantry, and they do have poison, so they do bring some utility. They're kind of like poison troll, the swamp trolls, but I would like to see them given a little bit more armor, maybe a tiny bit more leadership, just so they don't crumble. Though with their high HP and regen, it's not as much of an issue as on other units. I'd really mostly like to see them get a smidge more armor, make them a bit beefier against missile play. Nothing too crazy, but just shrug off a little bit more damage. Because when you think about it, a unit that, if you've only got 15 armor, these guys are on average, they're taking 90% of the non-AP damage. Whereas if you get, you can double that resistance value with doubling armor. You go up to 30 armor, you're now taking 22.5% less damage on average, which is better. It's still not great, but it does mean those goblins, archers, for example, are doing one entire less point of damage a shot. Those peasant bows are doing about 2 less damage a shot. Stuff like that. So it does that. It can add up a little bit. If you're dealing with free company, cheap archers, which you often see in this matchup, can make this unit just a little bit more appealing. Finally, Vargheists. These units, or I shouldn't say finally, because we still have one wonderful individual down there. But Vargheists, I guess not much of a surprise to many here. They got another buff, and they're a unit that just struggles to find its place. They're very, very flimsy. Despite the fact they became AP, the mass changes, or really knockback changes, have made them much more difficult to pull in and out of combat than they once were. I actually used to like these guys against Vampire Coast, but it's actually kind of become harder to use them against Vampire Coast when you get pinned in by zombies much more easily than you once did, which is kind of a problem. Vargheists could maybe be made a bit cheaper, just make them a little bit more of an expendable class cannon. Otherwise, go the other way and try to make them a bit beefier. Buff up their HP, buff up their armor, buff up their... give them a little bit of missile resistance. Anything to make them a little bit tankier. Give them hunger so that they can sustain a little bit better in sustained combat. Give them a bigger charge bonus so that they actually hit super hard on the charge. If they had, say, 50 charge bonus, suddenly you're looking at pretty monstrous weapon strength and melee attack on the charge. And it could be a pretty brutal sort of one-shot unit. But as it stands now, it's rather difficult, I think, to justify Vargheists. Even with the AP buff, yes, they are much better against cavalry, for example, than they once were. They're better against big flyers, but ultimately, it's very, very, very hard to justify these fellas. Because they just get shot to crap, and now they get penned in even easier than they once did. And finally, or maybe even give them Vanguard. Granted, that kind of screws the Regiment of Renown, which doesn't have too much going for it in the first place. But maybe give them Vanguard. Could also be an option. Open up the Empire counts to have more Vanguard options with some of the some cryptical. That's actually another option you can give Cryptars, Vanguard, but though I don't think that would be a bit goofy. But if you had to say Cryptical is able to Vanguard, have X-Rays able to Vanguard, Vargheists able to Vanguard, it would open a more of a Vanguard option for your army. And finally, the Corpse Cart with Balefire could get, in line with all my other suggestions, should get more leadership and Vanguard. No, just kidding. I know I've been suggesting those things a lot, so. But definitely not for the Corpse Cart with Balefire. Corpse Cart just sucks, or the Balefire Corpse Cart just sucks because Balefire effect is incredibly difficult to make use of. You're a slow unit, so getting in position in the first place is stupidly hard. And while the effect is brutal once you are in range, odds are you'll never get in range. And by the time you do get in range, your opponent has already used up a lot of Winds of Magic anyway, and isn't really as reliant, and has basically gotten off the spells they wanted to get off. So what could be done to buff that? One, I think Balefire Corpse Cart could have a constant effect regardless of if something is in range. That simply increases proportionally with more units in range. Otherwise, make it so it increases the cost of spells. rather than reducing enemy Winds of Magic recharge. I don't know if that's an option, but could be interesting to see. Make it something that makes it more difficult for your opponent to cast spells or more expensive. Maybe give it a cooldown increasing ability that it can target units with or affect all units in range. Some sort of slightly increased utility, I think, could be rather cool. Maybe reduce magic resistance on nearby units. Or on the flip side, make it increase magic resistance of your own units. It's supposed to confound enemy magical weapons and whatnot. Maybe make it, or confound enemy magic. So make it something that can help protect, say, a unit of Kharon Wraiths a little bit, or protect your troops from getting wiped out by a sudden bursty spell like Foot of Gork or whatever. Might not have the most insane amounts of magic resist, but say if it's 20-25%, it could be an interesting way to make the Corpse Guard have a little bit of a niche. Regardless, I think the Balefire Corpse Guard is just bad compared to the Lodestone and the generic Corpse Guard. Just because the additional effect is not worth it in 99% of matches. That said, that is it for Fixing the Forgotten Vampire Count Edition. If you guys enjoyed, as usual, leave a like, subscribe, and follow down below. And, of course, don't hesitate to put your own thoughts, opinions, comments, and critiques down below. If you have units that you think I missed and you think need improvements, don't hesitate to share them. If you have other ideas for what could be done to improve these characters and lords and heroes, don't hesitate to share. I'd honestly love to hear what you guys have to say. I'm not the most consummate Vampire Count player. I had a streak where I played them for quite a bit, but have definitely played them less in recent times. So perhaps there's something I'm missing, some unit that's fallen by the wayside, or some cool improvements that could help certain Vampire Count strategies that I just don't utilize. As always, don't hesitate to share. Leave your thoughts and opinions down below. I'll do my best to respond as soon as I can. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.